You're standing on a sidewalk on Wall Street. It's a bright Thursday morning, late October, 1929. And you notice something strange. A crowd is gathering outside the stock exchange. Quiet, not shouting, just gathering. You don't know it yet. But you are watching the exact moment the richest decade in American history begins to die. Here's what nobody tells you about that day. 3 years from now, the money inside that building will be worth almost nothing. The market is about to lose close to 90% of its value. The worst crash the United States has ever seen. Fortunes built over a lifetime, gone inside a single week. And the strangest part? The smartest men in the country swore it could never happen. One of the most famous economists alive had just gone on the record promising that the good times were permanent. He wasn't lying. He wasn't stupid. He simply could not see it. And in a moment, you'll understand exactly why. So how does an entire nation talk itself off a cliff? And why is the one number everyone remembers about this crash, the number in every single textbook, the wrong number to be afraid of? Stay with me all the way to the end, because that's the part that changes how you see all of it. This is the story of the day the money stopped. I dig up one forgotten money story like this every single week. So if that's your kind of history, do me one favor, subscribe right now. And come back with me to the Roaring Twenties, to a party nobody believed would ever end. To understand how it all fell, you first have to swallow something that sounds impossible. For 8 straight years, an entire country got richer by doing nothing. And I don't mean the bankers. I don't mean the tycoons in the corner offices. I mean the barber, the shoeshine boy, the man who drove your streetcar, your next-door neighbor. So rewind with me to August 1921. The Dow Jones sits at around 64. It's a boring number, a tired market crawling out of a small recession. Nobody's writing songs about it. Nobody's talking about it at dinner. But watch what happens next, because no American had ever lived through anything like it. 64 becomes 100, then 200, then 300. By the summer of 1929, it's closing in on 380. In 8 years, the market roughly sextupled. It multiplied itself 6 times over. And somewhere along that climb, the whole country quietly changed its mind about what the stock market even was. It stopped being a distant place where the rich parked their money, and it became something closer to a national religion. You've heard the old cliche, the shoeshine boy handing out stock tips to the men in suits. It's a cliche for one reason, because it was true. Everybody had a hot pick. Everybody knew a guy who doubled his money. And for the first time in the history of the country, ordinary working people believed something intoxicating. That you could get rich without working. You didn't need a trade. You didn't need to build anything. You just had to be in the market. And here's the part that makes the whole tragedy possible. For 8 years, they were right. Which leaves exactly one question. A question almost nobody stopped to ask on the way up. How does a barber buy stock? He doesn't have that kind of money lying around. And the answer to that question is where this story actually begins. Not with greed. With a mechanism. It was called buying on margin. And once you see how it worked, you'll understand why millions of people simply could not stop. Here's the whole trick. Say a share of stock costs $100. You don't put in 100. Back in 1928, you could put in as little as $10 of your own money, and your broker would lend you the other 90. Just like that, you own a $100 share, and you've risked almost nothing. Now watch what that does. The stock climbs to 120. You sell. You pay the broker back his 90. And the profit? That's all yours. $10 in, a small fortune out. It didn't feel like investing. It felt like alchemy. Like the market was quietly printing money, and all you had to do was stand underneath and hold out your hands. So millions of people did exactly that. Over and over. And every borrowed dollar they poured in pushed prices a little higher, which made the next person's bet look a little smarter, which pulled in still more borrowed money. The machine was feeding itself. Round and round, faster and faster. But borrowed money always comes from somewhere. And where all of this money was coming from, that is the real engine of this entire story. It's a single number. And it is so big that the first time you hear it, you're going to be sure it's a mistake. So where was all that borrowed money actually coming from? The answer is a single number. And I want you to really let it land, because the first time you hear it, you'll assume it's a typo. By the autumn of 1929, the loans that brokers had handed out to all those margin buyers added up to about $8.5 billion. Now, that number is just noise until you put it in the language of the time. Here it is. That pile of borrowed money was said to be larger than all the paper currency circulating in the entire United States. So read that slowly. There was more money bet on stocks going up than there were actual dollar bills in the whole country. Every note in every wallet, every till, every bank drawer, from coast to coast, added up, and it was still less than what the country had borrowed to gamble on the market. And the cash to fund all that betting was flooding in from everywhere, because the interest on it was simply impossible to refuse. Corporations, foreign banks, wealthy families, instead of building factories, instead of hiring workers, they shoveled their money into something called the calm money market, where, at one point in the spring of 1929, the rate spiked to around 20%. 20%, just to lend your money to a speculator for a few days. Ask yourself, why would anyone build something real, a factory, a business, a job, when the betting itself paid better than the building? And then this story gets genuinely strange. Because the smartest men on Wall Street looked at all that leverage, all that borrowed money, and instead of getting nervous, they started building machines out of it. They were called investment trusts. And the idea behind them is simpler than it sounds. A trust was just a company whose entire business was owning shares of other companies. That's it. You handed them your money, they bought a basket of stocks, and you owned a slice of the basket. Here's where it turned into something dangerous. Because the trusts started buying each other. One trust would use its money to buy shares in a second trust, and the second would buy into a third. Debt stacked on top of debt, stacked on top of debt. One economist later compared the whole arrangement to the children's game Crack the Whip, where a tiny little tug at one end sends a violent snap flying out the other. On the way up, that snap made everyone in the chain feel like a genius. A small rise at the bottom became a huge jump at the top, and the money seemed to multiply out of thin air. I want you to remember one name from all of this, because it's going to come back. In December of 1928, one of these trusts, the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, sold its shares at $104. Hold on to that number, 104. Because a little later in our story, this exact same stock is going to walk back onto the stage. And when it does, it will not be worth $104. It will be worth about $1.75. That, all of that, was the foundation holding up the greatest bull market in the history of the world. Not steel, not railroads, not factories full of workers making real things. Debt, stacked on debt, balanced on nothing but confidence. Now, here's something that should genuinely haunt you. Somebody did see it coming. Somebody stood up, in public, and said it out loud. And what happened to him, and to the man who shut him down, tells you everything about why nobody listened. It's September 5th, 1929. At a business conference, a statistician named Roger Babson stands up to speak. And he says a sentence that lands in the room like a slap across the face. Sooner or later, he warns, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. And here's the remarkable part. The market shuddered that very afternoon. Prices dropped. Traders were so rattled they actually gave it a name. They called it the Babson break. One man, one sentence, and the whole glittering machine trembled, which should tell you something important about that moment. Underneath all the confidence, underneath all the shoeshine boy optimism, everybody was already, quietly, terrified. They just needed permission to say it out loud. But the establishment closed ranks. And it closed ranks behind a giant. Because standing on the other side of Roger Babson was one of the most respected economists alive, Irving Fisher of Yale. A titan, the kind of man whose word could steady a nervous market all by itself. And Fisher answered Babson with a single phrase, a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life and haunt his name long after his death. Stock prices, he announced, had reached what looked like a permanently high plateau. Permanent. Sit with that word. Not a peak you eventually fall from, but a new, higher floor. A ground level you would simply never drop below again. The old rules, in other words, no longer applied. And the clever money nodded along with Fisher and laughed at Babson. Now here is the detail I need you to carry out of this whole section, because it's the entire tragedy of 1929 compressed down into one human being. Irving Fisher was not a con man. He was not a fool. He believed every word of what he said, believed it so completely, so totally, that his own personal fortune was sitting right there in that market. And so when the permanently high plateau turned out to be the edge of a cliff, Fisher didn't step back. He didn't pull his money out. He wrote it all the way down, and he lost nearly everything he had. The man who stood up and told America there was no cliff walked straight off it himself, still holding his own money. So the warnings were there. They were there the whole time. They just had the terrible bad luck of sounding like pessimism. And in the last, giddy, champagne weeks of a bubble, pessimism is the one thing on earth that nobody will buy. So come back to that Thursday morning. Come back to the sidewalk, where I left you at the very start, the quiet crowd, thickening by the minute. It's October 24th, 1929. History would give this day a name, Black Thursday. And what happens next is so cinematic that if you saw it in a movie, you'd roll your eyes. Except every single word of it is real. From the opening bell, the selling felt different. Heavier. Faster. With something like panic humming underneath it. And that beautiful money machine, the one that had lifted everyone up for 8 golden years, threw itself violently into reverse. Remember the barber? $10 of his own, 90 borrowed? Here's what happens to him now. His stock starts to fall. And the moment it does, his broker calls him. A margin call. Pay up. Cover the loan. Now. But the barber doesn't have it. He never had it. That was the whole point. So the broker does the only thing he can. He sells the barber out. He dumps the stock. And that forced sale pushes the price down a little further, which triggers the next margin call on the next person, which forces the next sale. The exact same leverage that had multiplied everyone's gains on the way up was now multiplying their losses on the way down. Automatically, mechanically, without mercy. By midday, the market was off about 11%. And that quiet crowd outside the exchange had spilled out into the street. And then comes the scene that belongs in a film. A few blocks away, at 23 Wall Street, the House of Morgan, the most powerful bankers in America lock themselves in a room. The head of the National City Bank, the head of Chase, the senior partner at Morgan himself. And they do something extraordinary. They pool their own fortunes together into one enormous fund to try to physically catch a falling market with their bare hands. And then they choose one man to walk out and do it in public. His name is Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange. And Whitney walks out onto that frantic, screaming trading floor. He strides right up to the post where U.S. steel is traded. And in a loud, calm, almost bored voice, he bids for a block of U.S. steel at $205, well above the going price. And then he doesn't stop. He keeps walking the floor, throwing out enormous bids on one blue-chip stock after another for everyone to see. It was pure theater. And, for a moment, it actually worked. Because the message was unmistakable. The big money is buying. The floor is right here. The grown-ups have finally arrived. And the market steadied. It stopped falling. It even rallied into the afternoon. By the closing bell, Thursday had clawed back almost everything it had lost. And afterward, the banker who spoke for the group, Thomas Lamont of Morgan, met the reporters outside. And he gave them one of the greatest understatements in the entire history of money. There had been, he said, a little distress selling on the stock exchange. A little distress selling. On the day the most famous crash of the 20th century began. And the thing is, they believed they had caught it. Friday held. Saturday, the market traded on Saturday mornings back then. Saturday held too. And for one long weekend, it genuinely looked like a handful of bankers had reached up and stopped the sky itself from falling. They were wrong. Monday, October 28th. The rescue died. There was no white knight this time. No calm man walking onto the floor to buy. The market simply fell. And fell. And closed down nearly 13% in a single day. Because it turned out there wasn't enough money in the House of Morgan. There wasn't enough money in the entire world to buy against a whole nation all trying to sell at the very same moment. And then came Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, the day the word crash was built for. Almost 16.5 million shares changed hands, a volume record that would stand for nearly 40 years. The market fell nearly 12% more. Put Monday and Tuesday together, back to back, and roughly a quarter of the market's entire value simply evaporated in 2 days. But the numbers, honestly, don't tell you what it felt like to be there. This next detail does. And it's stranger than any statistic. The stock ticker, that little machine that printed prices onto a thin ribbon of paper, physically could not keep up. There was so much selling, so many trades slamming through the system, that the tape fell hours behind the real market. So put yourself in a brokerage office that afternoon. Really stand there. You are ruined, or you are saved. One of the two, and you cannot know which. Because the prices scrolling under your fingers, the prices you're desperately reading, are prices from hours ago. They already happened. You are watching the past. And there is absolutely nothing you can do about a present that you cannot even see. Fortunes didn't just shrink in those hours. They vanished, silently, on a strip of paper that arrived too late to matter. And when the newspapers sat down the next morning to find words big enough to hold what had just happened, even they gave up. Even they reached for gallows humor. And the single most famous headline of the entire disaster didn't run in a bank's journal or a financial paper. It ran in Variety, the show business paper. 3 words: Wall Street lays an egg. Now here is where almost everyone gets this story wrong. And I'd bet, genuinely, that you got it wrong too, right up until this exact moment. Because most people think the last week of October was the disaster. The crash days, Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, the headlines, the ruined men. And it wasn't. That week wasn't the disaster. It was the opening scene of the disaster. Those famous crash days hammered the market, yes. But the market had so much further left to fall. It bounced through the winter. It recovered a little ground in early 1930. It gave people hope. The worst is behind us, it said. And then it just kept sinking. Slowly, relentlessly. For nearly 3 more years it ground lower and lower and lower until the 8th of July, 1932, when the Dow finally closed at just over 41. So now sit with those two numbers, side by side. The top, in September 1929, 381. The bottom, in the summer of 1932, 41. That is a fall of about 89%. Nearly 9 out of every $10 in the market, gone. And here's the problem with that number. The number everyone remembers is the top. 381. The record. The peak. It's the number in the textbooks. It's the number people point at. But the peak was never the danger. Remember what that 381 was actually made of. Remember the barber's 90 borrowed dollars. Remember the $8.5 billion in brokers' loans. More cash than there were dollar bills in the country. Remember the trusts, stacked on trusts, stacked on trusts. Every single point of that record-high number was, in part, bought with money that somebody owed to somebody else. So when prices started to fall, the debt didn't wait politely for things to settle down. The debt called. Margin calls forced sales. Sales forced prices down. Lower prices forced more margin calls. The whole beautiful machine, running in reverse, faster and faster and faster, all the way from 381 down to 41. The headline number was how high the market climbed. But the real number, the one you should actually have been afraid of the whole time, was how much of that climb was borrowed. And here's how deep the hole went. It would take the Dow 25 years, 25, all the way until 1954, just to crawl back to where it had stood on that one bright afternoon in September. Oh, and remember the name I told you to hold on to? The Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation. The trust whose shares sold at $104? At the bottom of all this, that same stock traded for around $1.75, from $104 to under $2. That is what leverage looks like when the whip finally cracks the other way. But here's a question that should stop you. A stock market crash, all by itself, doesn't have to become a decade of misery. Rich men had lost fortunes in market panics before. In 1893, in 1907, and each time, the country had brushed itself off, licked its wounds, and moved on. So why not this time? How did this one Wall Street crash turn into the Great Depression? How do numbers on a ticker tape, an abstraction, a strip of paper in Manhattan, become breadlines that wrap all the way around the block in every city in America? The answer runs through the banks. So follow the chain with me, one link at a time. As the panic spread out from Wall Street, ordinary Americans got scared. And I mean ordinary, people who had never bought a single share of stock in their entire lives. They didn't care about the Dow, but they had savings. And they got frightened for those savings. So they did the natural thing. They went down to their bank, and they lined up to pull their cash out. Now, here is the thing almost nobody understands about a bank. Your bank does not keep your money sitting in a vault, waiting for you. It lends most of it out. That's the whole business. So when enough people show up demanding their cash all at the very same moment, even a perfectly healthy bank, a well-run bank that did nothing wrong, can be completely dead by closing time. And it doesn't stop at one. Because one bank fails, which terrifies the customers of the next bank down the street, which starts another line, which kills another bank. And on and on. Between 1930 and 1933, something like 9,000 American banks went under. 9,000. And every single one of them was a neighborhood's life savings, a town's future, simply erased overnight. Now follow those dominoes all the way out, into the country you would actually recognize. When banks die and savings vanish, the total supply of money in the whole economy shrinks. By the bottom, it had contracted by roughly a third. And less money means less spending. And less spending means the factories can't sell what they make. And so the factories lay their workers off. And unemployment, which had been under 4% in 1929, climbed to around 25% by 1933. 1 in 4 American workers, with nowhere to go. That is the line. The actual, traceable, unbroken line. From a number scrolling on a ribbon of paper in New York to a man standing silently in a bread line under the Brooklyn Bridge. And it only truly stopped in March of 1933 when a newly sworn-in president shut down every single bank in the country, a national bank holiday, just to stop the bleeding, and then reopened only the ones strong enough to survive. And that how a crash became a catastrophe is exactly where the smartest people who have ever studied this stop agreeing with each other. So I'm going to be honest with you here. I'm not going to tell you who's right. Because brilliant people have spent 70 years fighting about this, and they are still fighting. But you deserve to know the main suspects. Because each one blames a different villain, and the villain you choose to believe completely changes the lesson you walk away with tonight. So let me give you the 4, one at a time. Suspect number 1 says it wasn't Wall Street at all. It was Washington. This is the argument of the economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. They said the crash could have stayed an ordinary recession, painful, but survivable, except that the Federal Reserve, the very institution built to stop banking panics, sat on its hands. It let the money supply collapse by a third. And to them, the Great Depression wasn't a failure of capitalism at all. It was a failure of the central bank to do its one and only job. Suspect number 2 follows John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes points somewhere else entirely, at demand. His argument was that the real poison was that people and businesses, frightened, simply stopped spending. Everyone hoarded. And once demand collapsed, only one thing could fill that hole and get the economy breathing again: massive spending by the government itself. Suspect number 3 is John Kenneth Galbraith. And hold on to his name, because we're going to come back to him in just a minute. Galbraith's answer is almost a rebuke of the other two. He says, stop hunting for a single trigger, a single guilty party. The boom itself was rotten to the core, propped up by exactly the wild speculation and the stacked debt that you and I have been watching this entire episode. The crash didn't cause the disaster. It just pulled the one loose thread, and the whole thing unraveled. And suspect number 4, led by the historian Barry Eichengreen, points at something bigger than any one country: the global gold standard. He argues it handcuffed central banks all over the world, and then exported the misery from one nation straight into the next, like a disease with no borders. Washington, demand, speculation, gold, for suspects, and no confession. And then comes the moment I love most in this entire story. In the year 2002, at a birthday party for Milton Friedman, a Federal Reserve official stood up to speak and answered Friedman's decades-old argument to his face. The official's name was Ben Bernanke, and 6 years after that night, he would be the man running the Federal Reserve through the 2008 financial crisis. But that, truly, is a whole other story. What Bernanke said that night, I'm going to give you word for word. He said, I would like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again. The head of the central bank, standing up in public and admitting that the central bank helped cause it. That, right there, is how alive this argument still is today. So let's strip it all the way back down, past the suspects, past the arguing. Because for all the fighting about causes, there's one thing every single suspect quietly agrees on. The crash of 1929 didn't destroy real wealth all at once. Think about it. The morning after Black Tuesday, the factories still stood. The wheat still grew in the fields. The workers could still work. The machines could still run. Nothing physical had been destroyed. What the crash destroyed was the illusion. In one single, terrible autumn, it pulled back the curtain and revealed how much of that towering, glittering wealth had never actually been wealth at all. It was debt, and it was trust. One borrowed against the other, higher and higher and higher, until one day somebody finally looked down. The peak said 381. Reality said 41. And the entire distance between those two numbers, that whole terrifying drop, was the exact amount that an entire country had quietly agreed to pretend. And that's the pattern. It's the pattern you're going to see again in every single story on this channel. Money looks rock solid, unshakable, permanent, right up until the very second that everyone stops believing in it. And that's the moment you finally find out what it was ever really made of. Now, if you want to go deeper on this one, there is a single book that towers over everything else written about it. It was written just 25 years after the crash by an economist who lived through the wreckage himself. The Great Crash 1929 by John Kenneth Galbraith. An enormous amount of what you heard tonight traces straight back to that book, and it is still the sharpest and honestly the funniest account ever written of how an entire nation talked itself right up to the edge of the abyss and then stepped off. The empires of paper always look the strongest right before the wind picks up. I'll see you in the next one.